believer becomes the fruit of the Lord. By faith, and their relationship to him is their source of life. And we see that spoken no better place than by Jesus himself in the first several verses of John 15. And there Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. And then he encourages us, abide in me and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is cast out as a branch and is withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they are burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, you will ask what you desire, and it shall be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, so you will be my disciples. So you see the spiritual application of the same thing that's going on physically on the earth for Israel. And we get to experience firsthand that we become the ones that can produce fruit because of who we're connected to. You know, I've found it interesting how great, in contrast, this description of Israel that we're reading here as a flourishing vineyard, how much it contrasts with the description earlier in chapter 5 of Isaiah, where the vineyard was in ruin. In chapter 5, we first hear Isaiah sing over Israel as God's vineyard, and he described how great and good God's intentions were for his people. And you see how many times God wanted to bring about what he'll eventually bring about, but he was willing to give it to them early, if at least pieces of it, if they were just obedient. And I'm going to take us back to chapter 5 for a moment. You can turn there with me if you'd like. But in the first 2 verses, we hear Isaiah sing over Israel about God's vineyard. And he says, now let me sing to my well-beloved, and well-beloved here is speaking of God, a song of my beloved regarding his vineyard. My well-beloved has a vineyard on a very fruitful hill. He dug it up and cleared out its stones and planted it with choicest vine. He built a tower in its midst and also made a winepress in it. So he expected it to bring forth good grapes, but as it would be, it brought forth wild grapes. And so there again, we're being shown a landscape. And there is a physical landscape, the land of Israel, God's land, that has always been prepared for his people. Matter of fact, remember, as the Exodus, he tried to lead them in there early, and they messed it all up even back then. And they've continued, even though they live in the land, they've only been given part of what was the land. And there's so many problems they have because they're still disobedient to this day and fail to see who the Messiah is. But God intended to give them a lot of what they would get full someday, way earlier, if they were just obedient. But it says good grapes is what God expected, but it brought forth wild grapes. So then we continue there in chapter 5 with verse 3, where God speaks regarding the abuse of his care and provision. It says, and now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge please between me and my vineyard. And God asked, what more could have been done to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why then, when I expected it to bring forth good grapes, did it bring forth wild grapes? And now, please let me tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it shall be burned, and break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will lay it waste. It shall not be pruned or dug, and there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds, that they rain no rain on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah and are his pleasant plant. He looked for justice, but behold, oppression, for righteousness, but behold, a cry for help. And so we almost see in that the picture of what would be the land when they finally came back into it, which they did in 1948, as was prophesied in the book of Daniel, the very day, the very month, the very year that they would be restored to the land. but it looked like that picture that we just read because they weren't obedient to what God wanted from them, and they suffered that. Because ultimately, it would take the Lord's work to make them right, and it's going to take the tribulation, the great tribulation, to make them right, at least a remnant of them, because it was impossible for them to achieve it on their own. Let's look at verse 7. Has he struck Israel as he struck those who struck him? Or has he been slain according to the slaughter of those who were slain by him? In measure, by sending it away, you contended with it. He removes it by his rough wind in the day of the east wind. Therefore, by the iniquity of Jacob will be covered, and this is all the fruit of taking away his sin. When he makes all the stones of the altar like chalk stones that are beaten to dust, wooden images and incense altars shall not stand. So even though the Lord struck Israel when they went astray, he still shows mercy to them because they're his special people, to which the church has been grafted in. We are his special people. And he shows us mercy where he doesn't have to, but he does. To this day, we get to share in that mercy of the Lord even when we go astray. And I always like to point out that mercy when we see the last days, when we see the tribulation painted for us in Revelation, we see that rhythm all the way through the book of Revelation where God brings the wrath and he pauses. And he brings the wrath and he pauses. Because even in the midst of finally pouring out the wrath, God is hopeful that some will come. And he just builds that rhythm all the way through because that's an act of mercy. That some would still come. Some would see what was unfolding and would still come. The Lord showed his mercy to Israel. We read here that because as he covers their sin, and this is ultimately fulfilled in the kingdom of the Messiah when all Israel will be saved. All that remains, that is. We read about that in Romans chapter 11. The Lord shows his mercy to Israel in that he destroys their idolatrous altars and images, forcing them to worship the Lord only. And I think about how that's happening for us today. You know, I believe that's absolutely a work of God today, that he is destroying the things that we depended upon. And I think he's going to take that to the point of only having him to depend on. I think that is the plan that we're watching unfold. And, you know, that makes us like believers all over the rest of the world, because believers in most of the world have already suffered such things. And we in this country really never have. But again, I think we're watching that process even today. Look at verse 10. Yet the fortified city will be desolate, the habitation forsaken and left like a wilderness. There the calf will feed, and there it will lie down and consume its branches. When its boughs are withered, they will be broken off. The women came and set them on fire, for it is a people of no understanding. Therefore he who made them will not have mercy on them, and he who formed them will show them no favor. So this fortified city here, some try to make this about Jerusalem. And I guess in some way you could stretch it for that, but we've talking about the city of man in prior chapters, where it's really talking about the world system. It's a picture of the world system. And we're told the world system will be made desolate by the judgment of the Lord. And you know, knowing this, it begs the question, why would anyone put their hope, their confidence, their expectation in the world system? And yet we see the majority of the world does that today. The world system will be made desolate, told that it will resemble a wilderness with bare branches useful only for fire. And you know, it's interesting because I think ultimately the world wants the favor of the Lord. I think they long for his favor, but they just aren't aware of it, or they're in denial of it. No matter though the world system, the citizens of the city of man will be shown no favor regardless of their excuse, because they rejected They rejected God in the end. And then our last two verses, and it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will thresh from the channel of the river of the brook of Egypt, and you will be gathered one by one, O you children of Israel. So it shall be in that day, the great trumpet will be blown. They will come who are about to perish in the land of Assyria, and they who are outcast in the land of Egypt, and shall worship the Lord in the holy mountain at Jerusalem. So in that day, the Lord will thresh out the true and the false within the land of Israel. The tares will finally be removed from amongst the wheat, because Jesus told us there will always be tares amongst the wheat, but we couldn't remove them because you would pull up the wheat along with them. But there will come that day that that threshing will take place. The tares will be pulled up and they'll be burned away. And then he's going to regather those Jews who are dispersed in the Gentile nations, and listed here in particular Assyria and Egypt. And we've seen that process has begun. You know, the journey back to the land by so many, but that'll come to a day of completion. And then back in the land, we see they'll come to Jerusalem to worship the Lord, where Jesus will rule and reign and have his throne, the throne of David. So we'll rest there for tonight. And again, that's really the conclusion to those 4 chapters that had that whole theme that really, again, is delineated pretty detailed, even though we don't understand it all in the book of Revelation. So any thoughts or questions?